even as you say, and it's true, that we will have challenges to find a broad set of partnerships in agriculture, you also remind us how many agricultural scientists and agricultural policy institutions are really thinking about the importance of diversity. And that, I think, is where we can find sort of common ground. And I think what we'll do now, if that's okay with you, Alexander, is to jump back to the FAO and to hear from you. So we, the conservation community, we desperately need to engage with agriculture. What are we going to find on the agricultural side? What do you see as what is the debate on your side of the fence about the future of agriculture?
Good morning, everybody, and I have to say I'm really happy to be here inside the conference and not outside the conference. I had the feeling there was kind of a firewall in the registration system with a very simple line in it: don't allow agriculture to enter the room. And this would have been a pity, not only because of for me, but I strongly believe that both sides, conservation and agriculture, need to go in a different direction, but together. The old picture was always here, the dirty brown agriculture, highly productive but destroying everything. On the other side, the beautiful green conservation and not really valued, but this is the real good thing. And every acre where you could not allow farmers to produce something is a good acre, because this could be used for conservation. I think the situation has completely changed, and I would like to, in 4 items, explain why I think there's an urgent need to develop work plans together where your issues of conservation and our issue of feeding the world could come together. This does not mean 100% of identical work plans and 100% of agreement, but there are major issues which can only be tackled if we work together. So why? Emil has already mentioned, today in the world we are producing food, enough food for everybody. It's a problem of access. Poor people don't have access, and even if you produce 100% more, poor people won't get access to food. So the whole question of how are we designing sustainable development is key. And we have to overcome the contradiction between development and conservation. And this goes far beyond agriculture. From my analysis, one of the biggest problems in the Rio+20 conference was that there was not a clear sustainable development agenda where your items, conservation, and our items, food security, and the items of my colleagues, I'm happy to lead them all here, with their specific issues, could have been brought under one umbrella. Instead of it, we are competing, and the competition will increase. So my first item is, if we look at the global drivers of change, maybe they have been all mentioned before, so I only would like to highlight them. Population growth. It does not make sense to look only at the absolute figures from 7 billion to 9 billion or to 10 billion by the end of the century. Look at where the population growth is going to happen. It's happening in Africa. The population of Africa will increase by 2 billion between now and the end of the century. A city like Lagos, population will quadruple, 400% more. A country like Ethiopia, today 80 million people, in future 180 million people within the next 40 years. This will put an enormous pressure on land and water, on biodiversity, on energy, on everything. And if we from the agriculture sector do not realize that we have to have a different approach to using natural resources, and if you from the conservation sector do not realize that the competition on the acre where agriculture and conservation takes place, we will lose both, and we will have a huge social issue. And therefore I'm convinced that our collaboration can at least provide some input to sustainable development. And this is an idea which I would like to discuss also in other sessions or with a glass of beer later in the evening. How can we join forces in order to develop an agenda for sustainable development where agriculture plays a role, for feeding a growing population, but also for providing ecosystem services. Urbanization, I've already mentioned it, means competition on water will increase, competition on energy will increase. Where should the clean water come from if the farmers do not manage natural resources in a different way? And by the way, if we don't manage them in a different way, the ecosystems will have to suffer a lot, because water will be diverted to agriculture or to urban areas or to industry. So only if you look at the problems ahead of us, and I did not talk about solutions until now, you see we are facing similar problems, and both of us are not powerful enough to say we will win the game. We can only lose if we don't work together. So the question is, in the interest of the poorest people who will suffer the most in the future, and I will come back in my next issue, we have to find a way to develop a paradigm of sustainable development where things are coming together. Second issue. FAO has published end of last year a report, the first global state of the world's land and water resources. This goes very much also in the direction Johan Rockström is working on planetary thresholds. We were looking narrow-minded, as we are, only at agricultural production systems. And you can see that major agricultural production systems today are at risk. Land degradation, groundwater depletion, biodiversity, whatever, pollution. So these systems, today highly productive, will over the next time lose their productivity in areas mainly where population is growing. For example, India. Professor Swaminathan can explain it in a perfect way. I will never be able to do it in a similar way. So major production systems today are at risk. They will lose productivity at the same time when the demand is growing. Food, energy, and. So again, in order to avoid that we get a big social issue and that the North against the South and rich against the poor will start a new competition, we have to find a way to work together. My third issue, always climate change. We are currently on a way towards 4 degrees increase on average temperature. This could mean for Africa 6 to 7. I don't have any idea how in sub-Saharan Africa we can manage ecosystems for food production and for nature conservation when the average temperature increases by 6 or 7 degrees. And nobody really knows it. We have a slight idea if you look at the United States, the Midwest, currently a heat wave. These are the most advanced production systems, improved varieties, latest technology, a lot of capital, well-trained farmers. It's getting a little bit higher in temperature and productivity goes down. This is an indicator that all production systems under climate change, not only in developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, will face major challenges. Climate change is a multiplier of already existing risks. So if you put all these 3 issues together, a growing demand, already existing systems under threat or at risk, climate change as a multiplier of risk, you can see that we are going far beyond agriculture. We are going into the area of conservation, we are going into the area of providing basic services for survival of mankind. And I'm convinced that agriculture can become part of the solution. We have excellent examples. We have traditional systems, they have survived over hundreds of years. Our initiative on globally important agricultural heritage systems, we have identified all around the world systems which have some rice terrace, rice fish systems, tea forests, dryland farming in Mongolia. They have survived over years and they have the potential to provide lessons for the rest of the agriculture community how to deal in a different way with agriculture. However, let's be frank, there's an issue of productivity. These issues are sustainable, but their productivity in the short term or the midterm is not as high as it is compared to all these high input systems. And we have to put this issue frank on the table because it doesn't make sense to hide behind nice systems and not knowing how to produce enough kilocalories or sustainable diets, following what Emil Frisson has said. We have systems which are very much based on agro-ecological principles. And here I would like to see a strong call for additional research. We know that these systems can provide more food, more ecosystem services, if they are managed in a different way. But over the last, I don't know how many decades, not enough research was done to invest in these systems. So we also have to look at how to link traditional systems, indigenous knowledge, with science and research in order to underpin the productivity of the systems, but in a sustainable way. And here I'm at my last point. It's the question of how are we going to organize the markets in the future? Because the markets are not good for conservation, and the markets are not good for sustainable agriculture. Because you don't get any penny, any cent, or no money for if you're doing agriculture in a sustainable way. If you only get paid for kilocalories, then ecosystem services, added value, you don't get the money for it. And farmers are in a big competition, especially small-scale farmers. Let's not forget, the bulk of the food, 60 to 70% of all food is produced by small-scale farmers. And if they should go into the traditional way of intensification, 50% have to leave their land. They could go into the urban slums. But if we could find a way to support them to be more productive in a sustainable way and earn higher income and also get some money for providing ecosystem services, the picture could change. And therefore, the challenge for all of us is even bigger than overcoming the competition between conservation and agriculture. This is the debate of yesterday. Very valid, will continue, but the challenge is even bigger. And therefore the question is, how can we create markets, or how can we create income for farmers if they produce in a different way, if they conserve agriculture, if they look at biodiversity, and if they manage natural resources in a different way. There are several models, not all working very well. Payment for environmental services, small scale, high transaction costs. The idea of RED to avoid deforestation, forest degradation, so a little bit of money. Labeling and certified production of food. So there are issues here and there, but what I'm missing is the real big picture, that we are working together to identify solutions where we, within the boundaries of the threshold of the natural resources here of our planet, can produce enough food for every man, every woman, and every child. At the same time, looking at ecosystem services that not only nature protection, but also the necessary, the delivery of clean air and clean water can really be guaranteed. And this is the challenge. And if we don't work together, and if we don't do the first steps, we will definitely not win this battle. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Alexander Müller. That was, I think, another incredibly inspirational call, not only to action, but also a call to us that we will, the kind of quality of nature of the allies that we will find within the agricultural institutions. That was wonderful. Now, you, the Prince, Siri, almost all the speakers, I think, have continually returned to the fact that this kind of new approach is going to take us into the territory, if you like, of traditional farming systems, of indigenous peoples, of other experience that we have with how we integrate agriculture, environmental management, the cultures, ways of life, and so on. And so I'm really pleased that the next speaker we will have is Victoria Tauri-Kupus, who, in addition to being the founder and director of a major indigenous NGO, Tebteba, also served for, I think, 5 years as the director, secretary of the chair, there we are, sorry, the chair of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and she's also much involved in the Indigenous Partnership on Agrobiodiversity and Food Sovereignty. So she's deeply qualified to talk about the role of traditional farmers, indigenous peoples, in this new way of thinking in a more integrated fashion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you to all of you who have spoken earlier. A lot of the things that you have said definitely resonates with the ideas and the thinking and all the actions that we are also taking as indigenous people. So I really appreciate very much the points that all of you have raised. The point that Mr. Müller has mentioned about small-scale farmers as very important, producing a major part of the food supply in the world today, I think is very important for us as indigenous peoples, because indeed most of our indigenous counterparts are small-scale farmers, but of course they are even more than that. So I think one of the, when I saw the title, which is a community, which is conservation, the competition between conservation and agriculture, I think for indigenous people this has never been a problem, as was mentioned also by Siri earlier. We always looked at agriculture as part of an integrated system, which of course includes water and culture as well as identity. Most of you would know indigenous peoples are usually determined by the main food that they produce and that they use. So we have salmon people, for instance, among the Algonquians. We have buffalo people, among some of the Native Americans. Corn people among the Nahuatl, the Mihe in Mexico, and so on and so forth. And this is really very much linked. That's precisely why we said that the agriculture systems, the place where we come from, is very much linked with our culture as well as our identity, and I think that's the way we should really look at agriculture, and that's why it's called. I think that's why culture is also in the later part of the term, because that really is what agriculture is all about. It's very much linked with culture. It's not just an economic system or a production system. It's also a whole cultural system, and I think for indigenous peoples, that's one of the major frameworks that we would really like to push for. If you can imagine, I was in Canada among some of the native Canadians whose salmon has been lost, because of the hydroelectric dams that were established, and the rivers, of course, changed course, and many of their salmon have been lost. It took them 60 years to study how to bring back the salmon into the rivers. It took that long because they had to get hydrologists, they have to get people who understand water, the biologists who understand the life of salmon to be able to bring them back, but it was for them a major celebration. I was there when they were celebrating when finally the salmon came home, and that is really very profound in terms of why should they spend all this energy and effort to do that? But that's precisely because of all the things that's associated with that kind of system. Of course, that's not agriculture, I mean, maybe in the sense of agriculture, but it's a food system. So really, this point of linking culture is a major issue for us, and I think when indigenous peoples have been participating in the major, global processes, whether this is the recent one, which was Rio +20. One of our main agenda items was to put culture as the fourth dimension of sustainable development. We really believe that culture should really be a major pillar of sustainable development, and unless we do that, we're really losing a lot of many of the aspects of what we call what the so-called sustainable development. That really makes a lot of gives a lot of meaning to many peoples, not just indigenous peoples, all over the world. In the studies that have been done in biodiversity, and even in my country, in the Philippines, there have been, the biodiversity program has mapped all these key biodiversity areas, so-called, they call it key biodiversity areas. In the Philippines, there's around 130 of these key biodiversity areas that were identified, and almost 90% of these are in indigenous territories. And of course, we also discovered that most of these places where the biodiversity remains are also the places where indigenous languages are still spoken. Many of the areas where the languages have not been spoken, there's a big settler population that came in. The biodiversity has also been lost, and there has been a lot of destruction in the ecosystem. And of course, there was a map. We had maps made, and it really shows the overlay between the biodiversity hotspots, the ancestral domains of indigenous peoples, and the language, the areas where most of the languages. We have more than 200 languages in the country, and this is where these languages are spoken. So that just goes to show the link, the integral link between agricultural biodiversity, and of course cultural diversity as expressed in languages languages and various cultures. Of course, these are still the areas where a lot of the rituals that we have are still practiced. I come from the Cordillera, where the rice terraces are, and a lot of our cultural rituals are very much linked with rice production. No? So from planting the said beads up to harvesting, there is an accompanying culture, a cultural ritual that comes along with that, which is for us something we need to do to be able to thank, of course, to maintain the reciprocal relationship we have with nature. So this is just to show that many of the indigenous systems, the traditional systems that Mr. Mueller spoke earlier, whether it's rotational agriculture, hunting and gathering, pastoralism, or high mountain agriculture, many of the traditional livelihood and agricultural systems, food systems of indigenous peoples have been sustained for millions of years, and these are still there. And the knowledge that is there in terms of sustaining these systems is still there, no? So I think that is for me a clear testimony and proof of the fact that these systems are working, and therefore we should really push towards getting more policies, government policies, to be changed, because most of the government policies have been policies to destroy these systems. You know, the shifting agriculture has been illegalized.